Hi everybody. In today's episode of Ask David, we're going to talk about flash guide numbers. Hey David, in my photography class, the professor was talking about knowing our flash's guide number so that we can properly expose images. What is a guide number? Good question. Most flashes don't tell you what their guide number is. It's not printed on the flash. I have an old-timey Minolta flash here, and it doesn't tell me anywhere what the guide number is. In fact, none of my flashes tell me what the guide number is. But here's what the guide number is: an indication of how powerful the flash is when it discharges at full power. Flashes with adjustable powers will have different guide numbers throughout the range of adjustable power settings. So here's how you come up with guide number. To determine the guide number that you need to use for an image, to figure it out, you need to multiply your aperture by your distance, and that will tell you your guide number. Now also understand that your guide number changes based on your ISO. So your guide number for 100 ISO for the same flash will be different than it is for a flash for a film or camera sensitivity at 400 or 50. So let's say that you are using an aperture of 4 at a distance of 20 feet. You'll need to have a guide number of 80, and that's a reasonably powerful flash. I mean, it's almost any flash that's not on the top of your camera, like a pop-up, that's like 15, but most flashes that you can get can do a guide number of 80, especially if it has 4 AA's in it. Some of the smaller ones might be 20 or 30. This assumes an ISO of 100. Likewise, knowing your guide number allows you to also figure out what your camera settings should be. Basically, the algebra here allows you to have 2 data points and figure out the third. So let's put this through some more simulations. I know my guide number. We'll say that my flash has a guide number of 60 with the settings I'm going to use, okay? And I know that I'm going to be 15 feet from my subject. My aperture needs to be 60 divided by 15, or 4. Okay, let's say that I'm going to use the exact same flash, but I'm going to get closer to my subject. I'm only going to be 10 feet from my subject this time. 60 divided by 10 means I need to have an aperture of 6. So let's say that I want to use this to figure out what my distance to my subject should be. We've seen how to figure out the guide number based on aperture and subject distance, and the aperture based on guide number and subject distance. But let's say I have a 75 guide number flash and I want to use an f3 aperture. I need to stand, that's right, 25 feet away from my subject. Now, the problem with guide numbers is that they assume 100 ISO, full power, flash pointed straight at the subject. Your guide number changes if you're going to bounce the flash off the ceiling and illuminate your subject from above, or if you're going to bounce it off a wall. Bouncing your flash means you have to increase your guide number. Unfortunately, because the situations for that are so variable, height of ceiling, distance to wall, color of ceiling, things like that, there aren't really any good guidelines for how that sort of thing affects your guide number. So what I tend to do is get a rough estimate of the distance to the ceiling and the distance to the subject from that, and then multiply by 1.5. So if I know my subject is 10 feet in front of me and the ceiling is 10 feet above me, that means that my flash is going to have to go about 14 feet, the light from it, to hit the subject. So I'm going to calculate the guide number as though the subject were 21 feet away from me. That accounts for the 14-ish feet of travel, as well as light loss when the flashlight hits the ceiling and scatters evenly and 180 degrees out from that point where it hit the ceiling. That does a pretty good job of getting enough light onto the subject in that situation, in my experience. So, okay, you know how to do that, but the problem is flashes as we just saw at the beginning of the video, aren't marked with their guide number. If only there were a way to use this to figure out what the guide number is. But there is a way to do it. So here's how you figure out what your flash's guide number is. You're going to grab your digital camera, because it's cheaper than using film, and you're going to set it to a known sensitivity. 100 ISO is the most simple. What you'll want to do is set up your digital camera with a flash on top of it, and then put a subject a known distance from your camera. Now we know the distance is 10 feet. So the first thing we're going to do is discharge this on full power. You always want to discharge on full power unless you're trying to find out the guide numbers for different settings. I'm going to discharge it on full power at f, let's say 16. Everything's going to be really dark unless you have a stupidly powerful flash. Now by the time you get down to something like an f8, f5.6, f6.3, in that range, things should be properly exposed. If you have a guide number of 80 on your flash, 10 feet, f8, proper exposure. Now you know at what aperture and what distance. Multiply your distance times the aperture with the best exposure. Now you know your guide number. So that's how you determine your guide number. But what if you're using a different ISO than 100? Everything we've seen here is based on 100 ISO, so let's figure it out for 400 ISO. So guide number 80 flash at f4 means 20 feet of distance with 100 ISO film. So let's say that we want to understand how the guide number is going to be changed if you're using a 400 ISO setting or film instead of 100 ISO. So far, all the math we've seen is for 100 ISO. So in order to understand 400 ISO, the equivalence, what we need to do is multiply the guide number by the number of EV differences. So 100 ISO to 400 ISO is plus 2 EV, plus 2 in the exposure value. So we need to multiply 80 times 2. What this means is that let's say you had two cameras set up next to each other, one with 100 ISO film and one with a 400 ISO film in it. And you had a single flash that would discharge at the moment that both of the cameras took the picture at the exact same second. Okay? On your 100 ISO film, the flash would behave like a guide number 80 flash, which is what it would be, right? On the 400 ISO film, it would behave like a guide number 160 flash. So the 400 ISO film, to get the same exposure as the 100 ISO film, needs to have f8 or 40 feet. So really, guide number is not a fixed number in the sense that it never changes. Like 100 ISO is a fixed number. f8 on a 50 millimeter lens is a fixed number. It's a relational number that allows you to understand your flash's power and how to use that to place your subject at the proper distance from your flash to get a properly exposed subject and a proper amount of light onto that subject from your flash.